The days that followed Marcus's departure from the royal guard felt like a blur. He was no longer a man bound by the rules of duty, no longer a silent figure standing at attention outside the palace gates. Every morning was a new beginning, and every decision he made felt like a fresh start. He had no uniform, no set routine, and no certainty about where his life was headed, but for the first time, he felt truly alive. Marcus spent the first few days wandering the city. Everything seemed new and different. The sights, the sounds. The people, it was all so much more vibrant than the world he had known. The city, which had once felt distant and foreign, now felt like a place he could belong. The first time in years he was free to explore, to experience life in ways he had never allowed himself before. He spent hours walking through busy streets, sitting in cafes, watching people go about their daily lives. He even took the time to visit the park, something he had never done during his time in the palace. There was something calming about being surrounded by nature. The sound of birds singing and the rustling of leaves in the trees. He could finally breathe, finally take in the world around him without the weight of duty pressing down on him. Eleanor was there for him every step of the way. She became a guide to the world outside the palace, introducing Marcus to new places, new people, and new experiences. She took him to art galleries, where he marveled at the beauty of the paintings. They attended live music performances, where Marcus discovered a love for jazz. They sat in cafes for hours, talking about everything and nothing, as the world outside moved on without them. Each moment was a reminder that life could be simple, yet full of wonder. At first, Marcus had been hesitant. He had been so used to the structured life of the royal guard that the idea of living without a strict schedule felt overwhelming. But with Eleanor's encouragement, he started to open up to the idea of living for himself. She taught him that it was okay to follow his own path, to make choices based on what made him happy, not what was expected of him. One evening, as they sat on a bench in the park, Marcus turned to Eleanor, a thoughtful expression on his face. "I've been thinking a lot lately," he said quietly. "I spent so many years following orders, never questioning anything. I was so focused on duty that I forgot about myself. I forgot what it meant to live for me." Eleanor smiled, her eyes filled with understanding. "You were never just a guard, Marcus. You're a person with dreams and desires of your own. It's okay to chase them now." Marcus nodded slowly, the weight of her words sinking in. He had spent so much of his life feeling like he was invisible, like his worth was tied to his uniform. But now, he was starting to understand that he was more than that. He had a future beyond the palace gates, and it was up to him to shape it. The days turned into weeks, and Marcus began to feel a sense of peace he had never known before. He found himself smiling more often, laughing freely, and embracing the spontaneity of life. He started to explore new opportunities, meeting people from all walks of life. He even started to pursue hobbies. He had always been curious about painting, photography, and even writing. For the first time, he felt like he was discovering who he truly was, beyond the title of guard. It wasn't easy, of course. There were moments when the old doubts crept back in, when he wondered if he had made the right choice, if leaving the royal guard had been a mistake. He still felt the weight of his past, the years of discipline and duty that had shaped him into the man he was. But with each new day, the fear of the unknown grew smaller. He realized that he had already taken the hardest step, leaving behind the life that no longer served a man now. He was free to build something new. One evening, as Marcus and Eleanor sat in a small restaurant enjoying dinner, Marcus noticed something he hadn't before. The man sitting at the table next to them was an older gentleman dressed in a sharp suit with a briefcase beside him. He was reading a newspaper, but every few minutes, he would glance up and look at the people around him, as though searching for something. Marcus found himself studying the man, wondering what his life was like. Was he living his dreams, or was he stuck in a life he didn't want, just as Marcus had been? As the man got up to leave, Marcus couldn't help but think about the choices people made in life. How often did people follow the path laid out for them, never questioning if it was the right one? How many people, like him, had forgotten to live for themselves, caught in the routine of their lives? Eleanor noticed Marcus's thoughtful expression and gave him a small, knowing smile. "You're thinking about all the people who never take the leap, aren't you?" Marcus nodded. Yeah, I guess I just wonder if everyone feels like I did. Like they're stuck in a life they didn't choose. Probably do, Eleanor said softly. But the important thing is that you did choose. You took the leap. And now you get to decide what happens next. That night, as Marcus lay in bed, he thought about her words. He had taken the leap. He had chosen to live for himself, to follow his own path, and to embrace the unknown. It wasn't always easy, but it was his choice. And for the first time, he felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be in the weeks that followed. Marcus's life continued to evolve. He found a job as a tour guide, showing visitors the city he had come to love. It wasn't a glamorous job, but it allowed him to connect with people, share his story, and help others see the beauty of the world around them. He felt a sense of fulfillment he had never known in the Royal Guard. He was no longer just standing. Still, he was moving forward, creating something meaningful for himself. One day, as he walked through the streets of the city, he felt a sense of pride in the life he was building. He had taken the leap, he had chosen freedom, and now he was living a life that was his own. There were still challenges ahead, and the future was uncertain, but Marcus knew that he was capable of handling whatever came his way. He wasn't just the Royal Guard anymore. He was Marcus, a man with dreams, a man with a future. And as he looked up at the sky, he smiled, knowing that his journey was only just beginning. The night was quiet, with the faint sound of distant traffic humming outside the palace gates. Inside, Marcus was standing at his post, as he had done countless times before. The familiar weight of his uniform settled over him, a reminder of the years he had spent guarding the royal family. His mind, however, was elsewhere. He couldn't stop thinking about the conversation he had had with Eleanor the day before. Her words had been like a spark, igniting a fire inside him that was impossible to ignore. "Maybe it's okay to dream of something different," she had said, her voice gentle yet firm, as though she had unlocked something deep inside him that had been buried for far too long. What if she was right? What if he didn't have to keep living like this, trapped in a routine that felt more like a cage than a life? Marcus had always known his duty was important, but now, for the first time, could see that he also had the right to choose his own path. He was more than just a guard in a uniform. He was a person with dreams, a person who deserved to feel alive. As he stood there, lost in thought, the world around him seemed to fade into the background. The tourists had long since left, and the streets outside the gates were now empty. The palace, once a place of grandeur and power, felt cold and distant. Marcus's role here, which had once filled him with pride, now felt like a weight on his shoulders. He could feel the walls of the palace closing in on him, and for the first time, he realized how much he longed for freedom. The idea of leaving the Royal Guard had been growing inside him for days. But it wasn't just a passing thought anymore. It was a decision that was quickly becoming impossible to ignore. He had spent years in service to the crown, but what had it truly given him? A life of silence, of standing still, of watching others live while he remained motionless. Could he continue this way, knowing there was so much more to life beyond these gates? Marcus glanced around, making sure no one was watching. It was late, and the palace grounds were deserted. The only sound was the soft rustling of the leaves in the trees. He knew this was his chance. This was the moment when everything could change. Without thinking, he reached up and unbuttoned his uniform jacket, the heavy fabric slipping from his shoulders. His heart was pounding in his chest as he looked down at the royal insignia on his sleeve. The symbol of his service, the emblem of everything he had given up to stand guard at the palace, and in that moment it felt like a chain, binding him to a life he no longer wanted. He took a deep breath and removed his jacket, folding it carefully. The air felt cooler against his skin, and the weight that had been pressing down on him for so long seemed to lift just a little. His hands trembled as he slowly unbuttoned the rest of his uniform. With each button, the familiar stiffness of his role loosened. And for the first time in years, he felt a sense of freedom, true freedom. The palace gates, which had once been a symbol of his duty, now felt like the barrier to his future. He knew he was about to do something that would change everything. His heart raced as he walked away from his post, leaving behind the uniform, the responsibilities, and the life he had known. He didn't look back. There was no time for doubt, no time for second-guessing. He had made up his mind, and there was no turning back. As Marcus stepped through the gates and onto the street beyond, a wave of emotion washed over him, fear, relief, excitement, all mixed together in a whirlwind of feelings. He had just done the unthinkable. He had walked away from the royal guard, from the life that had defined him for so long. For a moment, he stood there, unsure of what to do next. The world outside the palace walls was vast and unfamiliar. He had no plan, no clear idea of what the future held. But for the first time in years, he felt like he was in control of his own life. He wasn't just following orders anymore. He was making his own choices. As he took his first steps into the unknown, Marcus realized that he was no longer the man he had been when he entered the royal guard all those years ago. He had shed the uniform, and with it, the identity he had carried for so long. He was no longer the quiet, stoic guard standing at attention in front of the palace. He was Marcus, a man with the power to choose his own path. The sound of footsteps behind him pulled him from his thoughts. He turned, half expecting to see someone from the palace or another guard coming to stop him. But instead, it was Eleanor. She had been walking nearby and had seen him leave the palace gates. Her eyes widened in surprise as she caught sight of him, his uniform now gone, replaced by the simple clothes he had worn underneath. "You actually did it," Eleanor said, her voice a mixture of astonishment and admiration. "You really walked away." Marcus smiled, a feeling of pride swelling in his chest. "I did. I didn't think I could, but here I am. I'm free." Eleanor took a step closer, her eyes searching his face, as if she were trying to understand everything that had led him to this moment. "I'm proud of you," she said softly. "Not everyone would have the courage to do what you just did." Marcus felt a lump form in his throat. The weight of everything he had left behind, his years of service. The life he had known was still heavy, but hearing her words made him feel lighter. For the first time in a long time, he felt seen, understood. "I don't know what comes next," Marcus admitted, the uncertainty of the future settling in. "But I'm not going back. I can't. I've been living for everyone else for so long, I forgot how to live for myself." Eleanor nodded, her expression softening. "You've just taken the first step, and that's the hardest part. The rest will follow. You'll find your way." Marcus looked around at the unfamiliar city around him, the streets filled with people going about their lives. It felt strange, yet thrilling. The world seemed so much larger now, full of endless possibilities. For the first time in years, Marcus felt like he was part of something bigger than the walls of the palace. "I don't know what the future holds," he said quietly, "but I'm ready to find out." Eleanor smiled, her eyes sparkling with encouragement. "Then let's go find out together." As the two of them walked down the street, side by side, Marcus couldn't help but feel a sense of freedom he had never known before. He had made a choice to live, to embrace the unknown, and to step away from the life that had defined him. And though the road ahead was uncertain, he knew one thing for sure: he was no longer standing still. He was moving forward, toward a future of his own making. Days turned into weeks, and Marcus continued his shifts at the palace gates, but his mind was no longer completely focused on his duties. He still stood tall, still maintained his position, but something inside him had changed. The questions. The woman Eleanor, he had learned her name to be, had asked him, kept echoing in his mind. Could it be that he was truly missing out on something more? Was his life really all about standing still in front of a grand palace, guarding against threats that rarely came? Every day after his shifts, Marcus found himself thinking about Eleanor, in the strange, meaningful conversations they had begun to have. At first, their chats had been brief and casual, but as time passed, they became longer and more personal. Eleanor had a way of making him feel heard, as if his thoughts mattered. She never judged him for the quiet life he led. Instead, she encouraged him to talk about his frustrations, his dreams, and even his doubts. She would often share stories of her own life as a journalist, the places she had traveled to, the people she had met, and the experiences that shaped who she was. Each conversation left Marcus feeling more and more alive, like he was rediscovering a part of himself he had forgotten. He had never known someone who made him feel like his voice mattered. For the first time in years, he started to think about what he wanted. What did he want out of life? What was the point of living like this if he couldn't chase his own dreams? For so long, his life had been about discipline and service. Everything he did was for the monarchy, for the protection of others. But Marcus had never allowed himself to consider what he could do for himself. Now, after speaking to Eleanor, it felt like a whole new world was opening up to him. Where he wasn't just a guard, he was a man with a future, a man who could choose what path he wanted to follow. But the reality was complicated. Marcus knew that leaving the royal guard, even just questioning his role, wasn't something that would be taken lightly. He had spent years building his reputation and fulfilling his duties with pride, and to walk away from it all would be seen as an act of rebellion, one that might cost him everything. What would his fellow guards think? What would the public say? And most importantly, what would the royal family think? They had trusted him with their safety, and it felt like betraying that trust would be a betrayal of everything he had worked for. Yet, no matter how much he tried to ignore it, the feeling of dissatisfaction grew stronger. His conversations with Eleanor had opened something inside him, and he couldn't shake the thought that there was more to life than just standing still. The idea of freedom, of choosing his own path, started to consume him. Could he really keep living like this, day after day, without ever feeling like he had a say in his own life? One evening, after a particularly exhausting shift, Marcus found himself alone in his small apartment, staring at the blank walls. He had barely touched his dinner, his thoughts too heavy to focus on anything else. The hours of standing still had worn him down, and the quiet loneliness of his life seemed more suffocating than ever. He thought back to the words Eleanor had spoken to him. Maybe it's okay to dream of something different. Everyone deserves to have their own dreams, don't you think? He closed his eyes, replaying that moment in his mind. Her smile, the way she looked at him as though she understood, made him feel like he wasn't invisible. For the first time in years, someone saw him as more than just a soldier in a uniform. He was a person with hopes, fears, and desires, just like everyone else. But how could he change his life? How could he take the step toward something unknown when everything he had built was tied to this duty? He had been trained for this role his entire life. This was the life he knew, and it was hard to imagine a future outside of it. As he sat there, lost in thought, a decision started to form in his mind, a decision that scared him more than anything he had ever done. He realized that if he didn't act now, he might wake up years from now, still stuck in the same routine, still standing still in front of the palace gates, never having taken the chance to live a life that was truly his own. The next day, Marcus made his way to the palace gates for his shift. But this time, he couldn't shake the weight of the decision he had made. He felt different, more determined, but also scared. He had made up his mind. He couldn't keep living this way. Something had to change. As the day wore on, Marcus found himself more distracted than usual. His thoughts kept drifting to the idea of leaving, of walking away from the royal guard. What would that mean? How would he be remembered? Would anyone understand? Around midday, as he stood there, lost in his thoughts, a young tourist approached him. She was with a group, her eyes bright as she snapped pictures of the palace. She waved at him, smiling widely, and Marcus couldn't help but notice how carefree she seemed. It reminded him of the life he had always dreamed of, one filled with freedom, adventure, and a sense of connection to the world. The tourist came closer and, noticing his gaze, spoke up. "You must have an incredible view from here. Do you ever get to see the city beyond the palace?" Marcus didn't answer immediately. For the first time, he felt himself hesitate. It wasn't sure how to explain the complexities of his life to a stranger. He could only stand there and give her the answer he had always given. "I don't get to leave my post." The words felt hollow as they left his lips. He realized how true they were. He hadn't left the palace gates in years, except to return to his apartment. He hadn't seen the city, hadn't explored the world beyond the palace walls. As the tourist smiled and walked away, Marcus couldn't help but feel the truth of her question echo inside him. He'd never even considered it, but maybe he could leave the gates. Maybe he could choose a life that wasn't defined by his uniform. life that was his own. The thought felt both terrifying and exhilarating. He was at a breaking point, caught between the life he had always known and the possibility of something new, something unknown. But there was one thing Marcus now knew for sure. He couldn't keep living like this, not anymore. Later that night, as he lay in bed, the weight of his decision pressed down on him. He knew that change was coming, that it was time to step into the unknown. And though he was scared, he felt a strange sense of peace. Whatever happened next, it was a chance to truly live for the first time in years. Tomorrow, Marcus would make a choice that would change everything. Though the future was uncertain, he was ready to face it. The sun was beginning to set over the royal palace, casting long golden rays across the grand entrance. Marcus had just finished his morning shift and was standing by the gates, preparing to hand over his post to the next guard. His mind was still occupied with thoughts from earlier that day, the strange feeling of restlessness that had been creeping in, making it hard to concentrate on his usual duties as he gazed out across the palace grounds. A small group of tourists approached the gates, snapping pictures and admiring the beautiful architecture. Marcus had seen groups like this 1,000 times before, but today something caught his attention. Among the tourists, one woman stood out. She wasn't like the others. While most of the visitors were dressed casually, wearing bright colors and taking selfies with their phones, this woman was dressed in a professional, elegant outfit, a deep green blazer and a skirt that reached just below her knees. She had dark hair, pulled back into a neat ponytail, and a calm, focused expression on her face. She wasn't fidgeting or looking around like the rest of the group. Instead, she was standing still, her eyes scanning the palace as though she were taking it all in, not just as a tourist, but as someone who understood the history behind the walls. At first, Marcus didn't think much of it. It was just another visitor, after all. But as she walked closer to the gates, her eyes met his. For a brief moment, they locked. It wasn't anything unusual for a passerby to glance at the royal guards. But what was unusual was the way she looked at him directly into his eyes, as if she could see beyond the uniform, beyond the stone face he always tried to present. There was no fear, no awe, no sense of the distance most people felt when looking at someone in his position. Instead, there was curiosity. And something else, something he couldn't quite place. Marcus was used to people ignoring him, treating him as if he were a part of the background scenery, just another statue in front of the palace. But this woman didn't look away. She smiled, just a small, gentle smile, but it was enough to stir something inside him. For a moment, he forgot to breathe. He quickly turned his gaze away, feeling his heart beat just a little faster than usual. He wasn't used to that feeling, the feeling of being noticed in such a personal way. He wasn't sure if he should be flattered or uncomfortable, but he kept his eyes straight ahead, as he was trained to do. Yet the memory of her smile lingered in his mind. Long after she had passed by with the rest of her group, the next few days followed the same routine. Marcus would stand at his post, silent and unmoving, doing his job with the same sense of duty and pride he always had. But every now and then, his mind would wander back to that moment, the moment when the woman had looked at him and smiled. He couldn't understand why it had affected him so much. After all, he was a royal guard. He was used to being in the background, never the center of attention. It was his job to stand there without being noticed. Yet somehow, she had seen him. Then, to his surprise, a few days later, the same woman returned to the gates, this time alone. She stood in front of him, watching the palace as she had before, but this time there was no group around her. She seemed more focused, more determined, and once again their eyes met. Marcus felt his heart rate increase slightly, but this time he didn't look away. Instead, he held her gaze for just a little longer than he normally would. It was strange, almost as if they were sharing a silent moment, something that neither of them had expected or planned. The woman stepped closer, still holding his gaze, and to his surprise, she spoke. "You know," she began in a calm, clear voice, "it's fascinating how long you stand there like that. I can't imagine how hard it must be to stay so still, to never let your attention wander. You must have incredible discipline." Marcus was taken aback. No one had ever spoken to him like that before. "Sure, Tourists sometimes asked him questions, but they were always about the palace or the royal family, never about himself or his job. His job had always been something people simply admired from a distance, never something they wanted to talk about. For a moment, he wasn't sure how to respond. It wasn't like him to engage in conversation with strangers, but something about her was different. Her voice wasn't rushed or demanding. It was thoughtful and genuine. She seemed to be truly interested in him, not just in the palace behind him. "I'm used to it," Marcus replied quietly, his voice almost too soft to be heard over the busy street behind them. "It's part of the job." The woman smiled again, the same small, knowing smile from before. "I can imagine. But don't you ever feel ... trapped? Just standing there day after day, with nothing changing? Doesn't it ever make you wonder if there's more to life than this?" Marcus felt a shock of surprise rush through him. No one had ever asked him that question before. It was as if she had reached into his mind and pulled out the very thoughts he had been trying to ignore. The truth was, he had been feeling trapped for a while now, but he had never allowed himself to voice those thoughts, not even in his own mind. His duty was too important. His job was to protect, not to question. But here she was, someone he barely knew, asking him questions that were far too personal, yet somehow they felt completely natural. It was as if he had known her for years, as if they were old friends catching up. "I don't know," Marcus admitted, surprised by his own honesty. "Sometimes I wonder what it would be like to have a different life, to be ... free. But then I think about the job, about what I'm here for. It keeps me going." The woman nodded thoughtfully as though she understood. She didn't press him further, but her presence felt comforting, like she wasn't there to judge him, just to listen. After a few moments of silence, she spoke again. "Maybe," she said, her voice gentle, "it's okay to want more. Maybe it's okay to dream of something different. Everyone deserves to have their own dreams, don't you think?" Marcus stood still, processing her words. He had never allowed himself to dream of anything beyond the uniform. But now, as he listened to her, he began to wonder. Could it be possible? Could he really break free from the life he had built for himself? Before he could respond, the woman gave him another smile, one that seemed to say she had said enough for now. She turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd, leaving Marcus standing there with more questions than answers. As he watched her leave, he felt something stir inside him. For the first time in a long time, he felt like something had changed. Something inside him had shifted, and though he couldn't quite explain it, he knew his life would never be the same again. Marcus stood tall and still, his uniform crisp and flawless, his posture straight as an arrow. The wind gently ruffled his dark hair, but he didn't move. Not a single twitch. Not a single flinch. It was a typical morning in front of the royal palace, one of the most sacred and well-guarded places in the country. But for Marcus, this wasn't just any palace. It was where he had spent most of his life guarding the gates, ensuring no harm came to the royal family. For years, Marcus had been part of the royal guard, a highly selective position that few could ever attain. It was an honor, yes, but also a life that many couldn't truly understand unless they lived it. The royal guard wasn't just about wearing a sharp uniform and carrying a polished weapon. It was about duty. Duty to the crown, to the people, to the legacy that had been passed down through generations. Every guard, every soldier, knew that what they did wasn't just a job. It was a way of life. But for Marcus, as time went on, that duty began to feel like a heavy chain at first. When he had been chosen to become a royal guard, he had been filled with pride. It was the highest honor anyone could have hoped for. He remembered his first day in uniform, how he had felt like a symbol of strength and protection, standing guard as the monarch's representative. He had stood there with his chest out, filled with hope for the future. At that time, the idea of being part of something so prestigious was enough to make him feel alive. But as the years passed, the excitement began to fade. The days blurred into one another. Every morning, Marcus would wake up before the sun rose. He would iron his uniform until it gleamed, make sure every crease was perfect, and polish his shoes to a mirror-like shine. He would eat a simple breakfast, often alone, before heading out to the palace grounds. Once at his post, he would stand in one spot, staring ahead, barely able to blink for hours at a time. The only thing that moved was the occasional wave of people passing by, unaware of the man in the uniform, silently watching over them. It wasn't that he didn't enjoy the sense of security he provided. It was just that the life of a guard was incredibly lonely. He was isolated from the world outside the palace. He rarely got to speak with his fellow guards, who were also bound by the same rigid rules and duties. Small talk was almost forbidden. In fact, most of the time, they didn't even look at each other, except when they had to change shifts. For hours, Marcus stood alone, feeling like a statue, standing guard over a life that wasn't his to live. At night, after his shift, Marcus would return to his small, plain apartment. There were no parties, no friends to visit, no exciting adventures. It was just silence. He would eat a quick dinner, sit in front of the TV, and stare at the screen without truly watching. Every day felt the same. No excitement. No purpose beyond the palace walls. He had never really had time for relationships. How could he? He was always on duty, and when he wasn't on duty, he was too tired to engage in anything else. He had watched his friends from his younger years get married, have children, and live lives full of connection. But he was different. His life was in the uniform, in the silent, stoic role that had defined him for so long. There were times when Marcus would look at the crowds that passed by the gates. He would see families walking together, laughing, and enjoying the simple moments. They didn't have the burdens he carried. They were free to live, to make choices, to experience life in a way that he couldn't. Every time he saw them, a part of him longed for something more, but he could never have it. It wasn't that he didn't appreciate his position, but the truth was, after years of service, Marcus felt trapped. He had given up his freedom for a life of duty, of silence, and of watching over others. The problem wasn't with the palace, or even the royal family he served, but with himself. He was torn. He was proud of the work he did, yet the feeling of being invisible, of living a life of routine with no personal connections, this began to weigh on him. But one thing kept him going, his sense of duty. It was ingrained in him. It was what he had always been told was most important. Duty above all, they had drilled into him since the first day he'd been accepted into the royal guard. The idea that everything else, his personal desires, his future, came second to the safety and protection of the royal family. He had believed it, and for years it was enough. But now, as he stood in front of the palace gates on yet another quiet morning, something felt different. It wasn't the same quiet satisfaction that used to fill him as he stood there, guarding the gates. There was a restlessness inside him, something he hadn't felt before. It wasn't that he didn't take pride in his job anymore, but the weight of all the years, all the solitude, began to press down on him. And as he stared ahead, watching the morning sun rise above the palace, casting long shadows on the ground, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing from his life. Something that wasn't in the uniform. Something that wasn't in the palace walls. He thought about the world outside, how much life he had missed. How much of the world he had never experienced. How many moments he had passed by without ever truly living them. The thought was fleeting, and for a moment, he pushed it away, focusing back on his task at hand. Duty first, he reminded himself, but the idea lingered, hanging in the back of his mind. Like a shadow he couldn't ignore. Today, like every other day, he would stand there and watch. Watch the world go by. Watch people live their lives. Watch the families come and go, unaware of the man standing just a few feet away. But this time, something about it felt different. The weight on his shoulders felt heavier than usual. Marcus didn't know it yet, but his life was about to change in ways he couldn't predict. Today wasn't just another day in the palace. It was the beginning of something new. And the spark of change, so small and quiet at first, was already beginning to take hold inside him.